this is the Provoked Prawn, and here I'm going to show you how to build the Lian Dynamic EVO XL in the traditional layout with SL140 and 120 infinity fans, as well as the LCD Galahad II cooler, and a number of other highlights. Now, I have built previously in this case in a number of different positions and with various different peripherals, and I'll link to a video in the description where I've shown off all the different things that you can do with it, because it is a highly flexible case. You'll see here, for example, with an upright GPU mounted and a top mounted 360mm radiator with push-pull and various different other setups, including reverse fans, performance fans, and reverse upside down build here, which you can see, which looks insane. And I've done a video separately on how to do that if you're interested. But in this in-depth build guide, I'm going to talk to you about the format of the case and how to set it up in a classic way that you saw at the beginning. So if you're just interested in building in it, making it look awesome, and finding out more about how to do it and all the different things of interest, then stick with me. This is going to be a long video, so I will leave timestamps to make it easier for you to get around, but hopefully you'll find this in-depth video really useful. So stick with me now as we go into this case. It's a very flexible case, as you've seen from those initial shots, and has some really fantastic highlights to it, including really easy removable dust trays. See that massive one at the bottom, for example. You have multiple USB ports, which are also repositionable, and I've shown that in a previous video. But you've got 4 USB-A's, and that's something you'll need to bear in mind, because we'll need connections for that on the motherboard, and I'll get to that later on. You've also seen that you can adjust the motherboard positioning as well, so more on that as well. Most of the panels come off with thumb screws, and there are some other little screws holding the glass panels in place. So we're going to take it all apart. I'm going to show you what to do and where things go and the logic of how we're going to set this up. Obviously, make sure to remove all the magnetic dust panels and give yourself easy access to these things. Now, there are a couple of tiny screws holding on the side glass panel and the front one. And so take those out, and then you just need to pull the panel towards you and lift it up slightly. I will make a note here to take care not to lose those little screws, because they are really tiny. So what I do with this is put them back in the case. It just makes life a little bit easier so they don't get mislaid. So once you've taken the glass off, just screw that back into the hole on top there. Keep that for safekeeping. Obviously, you'll need to remove it again when you go to put the glass back on when you're finished building, but it will make life a bit more secure. And then do the same for the front panel as well. And you can take that off. I would recommend removing that panel, because it gives you much easier access to the side fan tray, and just reaching around later on when you're trying to build, it is a bit of a nightmare otherwise. The back panel just pops off, and you'll see there's 2 magnetic dust covers on there, and then you've got access to a mass of storage capabilities at the rear, SSDs and hard disk drive storage locations. I'm going to show you how to install those in a minute, but you'll notice the door here is held on with magnets, and that just pops out. And these are hot swap bays with the hard disk drive SSD trays, so they can just come out like that. You can unscrew and then tug your drives out if you want to. So if you've got this in a position on your desk where you can easily access it, you can just pull the drives out on a whim. They also have power cables and data cables coming out of them. So basically your drive just pops in. You don't need to worry about plugging it in at the other end, which is really nice. Although obviously you still need to plug those cables in, and I'll show you that later on, because I'm going to go into everything you need to know on it. And then there's a whole load of front panel connections, which I'll also show you later on as well. So stick with me for that. You'll notice this is a really roomy case, even at the back, and especially with my cable management, which you'll see later on is terrible. But this is great because it gives you loads of potential for tidying things up. There's already, you can see, various different cable ties, hooks, loops, and Velcro ties in there to make life more straightforward. Now, the tray for removing the drive bays, you can see there's a little screw on there. You basically slide that across, and then there's 2 bays in there that you can easily remove. And I get to the installation of those drives in a minute. Inside the box, you'll also find a cardboard box full of accessories. And I do mean full, because it's got loads of things in here, including an anti-sag bracket for your GPU, which I'll show you in a second, and a number of other things, which I have covered a little bit in the past. Got an extension lead for your HD audio, for example. If you're doing a reverse build, that's useful. You've got these blanking plates for the side fan tray, if you're putting fans on there, so it looks neater. You've got additional cable ties and more things as well. There's loads going on here, and it's really well set up to optimize your build. The anti-sag bracket is obviously designed to help your GPU if you're putting it in the traditional horizontal format. Standard installation, you can use this to then support it so it doesn't sag over time. It actually installs on top of the motherboard using the standoffs included, and it's really neat and very nice. One of the downsides to the build is you will need to take some time to sort out the screws though, unfortunately. Lian includes a little box here with all the various different screws and other things. Unfortunately, all the screws are then bagged up in a plastic bag, so you have to sort it out yourself. So this is actually very handy once you've got it sorted out, especially if, like me, you change the build in future. Basically, you can section off this little box and create compartments for the various different screws, and then you just need to go through, sort them out, and then put them inside there for storage reasons. This makes it easy to access those screws when you go to install the various things, but it also ensures if you want to change anything in future or add more, and you know where they are, and they're easily stored. It's a really nice highlight. I just wish it was already pre-filled for you. I know that's a small complaint, but just something to bear in mind, you will need to spend some time on this. Luckily, as you'll see in a second, the manual comes obviously with an inventory list which shows you all the different screws, where they go, what they're used for, and then you can easily just follow that and sort them out. You will see the long screws here on the right hand side. Pay attention to those because we're going to use those for a fan in a minute. I want to show you, it's pretty interesting. But here you can see the list of everything that's included, and I've sorted them out into neat piles, and then you just put them in the box and keep them all contained. I would highly recommend using this as well so they don't get mixed up, and it makes just life a little bit easier as you're going through the build process. Pause here obviously if you've lost the manual to see which screws go where and what's for what. Now I want to quickly show you a bit further on in the build process, or one of the other builds I did, because there are some interesting highlights to think about before you start building if you're not aware already. This motherboard tray is highly adjustable, for example, so you can put the motherboard in there and then obviously screw it down with the various motherboard screws that are included in there, which are the very small ones. And once that's secured, you can then take the motherboard tray out, which is useful because it means you can access the back plate on the back of it if you want to install a standoff for a cooler, but it also means that you can reposition it. At the rear of the case, there are various different thumb screws that you can remove, and once you take those off, you can then remove panels and move the motherboard up and down. Now, the motherboard tray allows for top, bottom, and middle positioning, and depending on where you put it, will impact what you're doing with your build. And I'm actually using this in various different ways. If you've seen the other videos on it, you'll know what you can do in terms of if you position it in one way, you can put fans, extra fans in places. But in this logic, what I'm going to do a little later on is position it kind of high up because I want to be able to use the strimmer cables for the GPU coming from below. Think about this sort of logic and what you're going to do, because perhaps you might want to mount it low down, for example. You might want to put it on the bottom rung. That then allows you to top mount a push-pull radiator above and still have loads of space up there. Something to consider. So you can do that, or maybe you want to top mount so that you can access loads. You can see just how much space there is down the bottom once you've done this. You'll have extra room down there. So if you're doing, for example, a custom loop system, perhaps you want extra space at the bottom for radiators and reservoirs or other things. And if you do it the other way, so if you put it at the bottom, you can then make use of more fans at the top. So if you position the motherboard right down the bottom, you can actually put two 120mm fans at the top rear, which is pretty flexible. So it's highly flexible, but it's worth thinking about this before we get into the build so you can work out what you're going to do and how to do it. But you can see that it is really easy to do. So it is actually possible to maneuver this around even when you've started building or you're quite far into the build. So you don't necessarily need to panic, but I just wanted to demonstrate this now so that it's in your mind as we go through the build or as you plan out your build. So you'll see now if you put it in the bottom position, that opens up flexibility to basically put more exhaust fans on there. So here you can see Lian Li's performance fans, for example. Now we've got two 120mm fans at the rear and 3 on the top. This is one of several different options for layouts and an interesting one. Another highlight is you can potentially have 4 120mm fans on top. That isn't obvious from the specifications, but it is actually possible. I have shown it. You can see it here. The fans will mount that way if you want to do that. Now with the GPU mounting, I want to quickly show another highlight here. So interesting GPU setup. There's a couple of doors at the rear that are held on with thumb screws. Once you've maneuvered those out of the way, you can just basically lift the flaps down, and then you can take out the PCIe brackets and remove those. You'll notice that they're not held on with screws, which is fairly unusual. Most cases will hold those in with screws, so it's much easier to remove. Then we've got the anti-sag bracket, which I want to show you the setup process for, because it's really straightforward, and this is well worth installing. But again, it's worth thinking about before you go into the full build, because you will need to do it to your motherboard and you don't want to get too far in. So essentially, this is a little bracket that will mount onto the standoffs, and it sits on top of your motherboard, and you need some initial setup that you can see me doing here. So there's a little rubber sticker that sits on top of this bracketing, for example. That will obviously press against your GPU so it won't scratch it, and that's beneficial there. And then you just need to line that up, and there's a small screw included that you screw it into the little bracket on the bottom here, and that's basically securing that down. And then we need to just set up the motherboard to install this in a second. This is a nice addition and speaks volumes to the various different things about this case. You've already seen quite a few different highlights to it. It is a wonderful case for building in for a variety of reasons. So I've installed the motherboard as standard here, which obviously you wouldn't do. So I'm going to just take those standoff screws out. So just the two standoff screws on the right hand side of the motherboard. This is an ATX motherboard. The E-ATX setup is ever so slightly different. Unfortunately, I don't have one to be able to cover that right now. But you use the black standoff screws that are included in the box, and they screw into the ones that are already on the motherboard tray. The motherboard sits on top of those, and then these black ones sit on top of that. And then the bracketing for the anti-sag bracket sits on top of that and uses black motherboard screws to screw into those standoffs. So it sits right on the right hand side here, which obviously, depending on the length of your GPU, is going to offer support either to the very end or somewhere in the middle. You'll see later on that I've got a 4090 in here, which is pretty long, and it's about 3/4 of the way along in terms of supporting that. It's going to vary, obviously, depending on your build. But for demo purposes, here's a 3090, and we just plug that into the top slot as you normally would. And then once that's slotted in, you can then adjust that bracket at the bottom. And it's just got a button on the side of it, so you just press the button in and lift it up and down and adjust it according to where you need it for the best support. So it's really straightforward. Now, obviously, this is quite late in the build, so now we're going to rewind a little bit, and I'm going to show you some of the steps for SSDs and hard disk drive mounting. So for the SSDs, there's actually a couple of different options, and one of them is very flexible, so we're going to start with that. You need these little anti-vibration rubber mounts, and then some of these screws here that you can see that have a very flat top in them, and we're going to screw those in now. What this does is basically gives you little clips to then notch your SSD into the case, and you actually have a number of options in terms of where you're going to pop it. And you'll see that there are actually masses of these, so potentially you can install loads of drives in here if you've got the room. So this Kingston drive will slip in, and you can put it in the middle, and then you just basically slide it in on the rear here, and then you just need to screw those screws down to secure it in place. What I found was it's a little bit fiddly if you screwed the screws too far in, so just adjust them slightly, slide it over, and then screw it down so it holds them there. Now, obviously, you've got 3 different positions on this tray where you could mount the SSDs, so you could potentially have 3, which is nuts. And you'll notice that you could also mount them directly to the case itself on the rear, so there's a lot of the same sort of holes in there as well. Now, this is really going to vary depending on what you've got installed. As you'll see later on, I end up with 3 controllers, obviously a power supply unit, and a mass of other things, so it's not easy. Alternatively, you can use the hard disk drive bay. So this works with both SSDs and hard disk drives, and obviously it has the advantage of being hop swap, so you don't need to worry about cables coming out of your SSDs, which makes life a little bit more straightforward and less fiddly. So now what you do here is you have to obviously mount the drive to the bay, paying attention to how that bay has come out of the hard disk drive cage, because you need to make sure you position the connections on the SSD or hard disk drive so that they will slide in to the socketing on the tray itself when you put it back. So it's important to pay attention to that. Basically, the drive has to sit right along the edge. Obviously, the screw holes will line up, and that will make life easier. These are the same screws, by the way, that you'd use to install your motherboard as well. So they've got a small top to them, very small screws. So watch out for those. And that's that setup. And then the hard disk drives. Same sort of logic. You need to make sure, obviously, you line it up again so it's near the bottom, and then just screw in the screws. There are different screws for the hard disk drives, obviously. Now, theoretically, obviously, you could have 2 hard disk drives or 2 SSDs in here, and you can do the same in the other bay. So potentially you could have 4 hard disk drives, and then you could have 3 SSDs, or maybe more, along that tray that I showed you a second ago. So if you've got loads of storage, or you want to put loads of storage in here, there's plenty of options. So it's very flexible in that way. And then they just slide in and click into place and have that connection on them. And then there's the cables that you need to connect to your motherboard and obviously to your power supply unit to power them and send the data to your PC. So really nice setup there, and because they're hot swap, you can just basically pop them out with ease. Now, one of the interesting highlights here is you can actually mount a fan on this cage as well. So if you're worried about it overheating, you can add a fan to it. Now, you do need a low profile fan. You'll see this is quite a slim one from Corsair that I happen to have. So these are smaller than your average fan. You can't put a standard 120mm fan on there. It has to be thinner, but it will sit on there, and then you can put air into that bay from the outside of the case, and use the long screws that I mentioned earlier on, basically go through the fan and mount into the cage. You can do this on both, obviously. Both those bays will accompany one of these, although, you know, whether both hard disk drives that are inside will get enough air remains to be seen, because obviously, you know, you've got a fan blowing onto something, and then potentially that's blocking the one behind. But it's nice to have that extra airflow, because I have seen people comment before that they're worried about that. Now, if you're not going to be using both bays, you can remove them. You can take both out, or you could just take one out to free up some space. In the initial build that I did here with the performance fans, I actually ended up using a Corsair Shift power supply unit, which has its cables coming out of an unusual position, which meant that this bottom bay was in the way. So I just took it out. You'll notice that there's a little clip that holds the cables in place, but just a quick look at that, you'll see 2 data cables and 1 SATA power as well. So pay attention there to what you need. But if you are planning on using a Shift power supply unit, you can see that it will fit if you remove that cage. So something to think about. And then we've got a lot of cabling. Taking those bays out does mean that you've got more space, though. You can see we've got a lot more space down the bottom now, and that's freed up, and it does make it easier to plug cables in and things. And you can see that there's plenty of room there, even with all those cables. Don't forget, though, we do need to connect things up. So if you do have your power supply unit installed, make sure you use your SATA power to connect up, for example, the front power for the RGB lighting strip on the front of the case, and also any SSDs that you're going to be installing or hard disk drives in those cages. They'll need powering too. So now it's worth plugging those in and making sure they're connected. And I'm going to do more on the powering, wiring and such a little later on, because I actually am not going to use the Shift in this build that you'll see. So I just wanted to demo a few different things before we got into that. One of the other things you'll see, we have those various different metal hooks for the cable management. So you can obviously slide the various cables through there. But the other thing that's nice about them is they're also removable, because like the SSDs, they're basically holding with screws and clips. So you can actually move them into different places. You can put them in the same sort of positioning, or you can put them sideways on, as I have done here, which makes them highly adjustable, and you can easily position them. So not only are they a big sort of loop that sits over your cables, but they also have a Velcro tie on top. So you've got the ability to easily manage your cables without loads of plastic cable ties. For this build, I'm using a Strix Z790 motherboard, and I'm going to show you the setup process for that now and all the different things in it. I'm using a Core i9-13900K processor, along with 64GB of Kingston Fury Beast RAM and a number of other things. And I am using a Galahad cooler to cool this i9 CPU, so more on that in the near future. I'm also using a number of NVMe SSDs, including the crucial T700, which is actually a Gen 5 drive, which might not make sense with this motherboard because it's only Gen 4, but something to bear in mind. We're then going to install the CPU. So I'm going to show you some of the basic setup here, if you're not aware already. For an Intel setup, you basically just need to remove that top cap, then gently lower the CPU in, taking care not to damage the pins. If you do damage the pins on the motherboard, it can cause all sorts of problems. So be very careful when lowering that in, and then just put that latch back down and remove the plastic cap. If you're installing 2 sticks of RAM, you want to put them in slots A2 and B2, which is the second slot away from the CPU and the 4th slot. That will ensure that XMP will work properly and that your system will boot. I'm going to use 4 sticks simply because I use 64 gigs for various different things, including video editing. But 2 will do for most people. And if you are using 4, obviously you don't need to think about where you're installing it. Just put all 4 in and away you go. So this is actually really nice RGB RAM, as you'll see. And this is DDR4 because that's what the motherboard is. And I've done a video on this motherboard separately if you want to find out more about that, as well as on the crucial drives, so the T700, for example, which is a really fast drive with its own massive heatsink that you can see there. So if you're installing NVMe SSDs, a few tips quickly as well. With most modern motherboards, you'll have various different heat shields like this one here that you can see. Take that off and you'll find plastic stickers on the underside covering various thermal pads. Before you install your drives, make sure you take those stickers off, but keep the thermal pads in place because they are very important. Even if you have a nice big heat shield like this, thermal pads can make a big difference. I've done a video on how much difference the heat shields and stickers and other things make. I'll link to in the description. I'm also using Crucial P5 Plus and a T700 without that massive heat shield as well. And because I just got masses of storage that I need for video editing, for games, for clips and all sorts of other things. You don't necessarily need this many drives, but it is a lot easier, as you can see, than installing hard disk drives and SSDs because they basically just notch into place with relative ease. But do make sure you put those heat shields back on so that the thermal pads can help with dissipating the heat. Now I'm using the Galahad 360mm LCD cooler, and I've done a video separately on this and how to set it up, but I'm going to go through the same process now if you want to do the same and the logic of it and show it off because it's a very nice cooler, as you can see. 360mm cooler with a really nice radiator. The Infinity fans are already pre-installed, which is excellent because I'm going to be using Infinity fans throughout the build anyway. The interesting thing here is that those Infinity fans have the 2 cables for RGB and fan power from the daisy-chained setup, and that is a bit more sort of old school from Lian, and I'll show you the connections for that in a second. The pump head has pre-applied the thermal paste, and the connections on it are also really straightforward. Now it has a display on it that's capable of showing things like GIFs, temperature readouts, and Lian's logo and more, so it's a really nice cooler. It's also got an Acertec 8th gen pump on it, so really efficient and quiet. On the side, you'll notice there's a USB-C connection as well as a larger connector. You actually don't need the larger one for the Infinity model, but you'll see there's also a single cable that comes out here that connects up to the AIO pump header on your motherboard. The setup for this is actually really straightforward with an Intel build like this. I'm just going to use another motherboard to demonstrate this, but this connects up to the AIO pump header as I've shown on this motherboard. A 4mm motherboard is on the top right, and you'll see it marked AIO pump. It may well be AIO sys pump or something similar labeling like that on your motherboard. Check the manual to find out where it is, but that connects up in that way. Obviously, I'm showing you this outside the case just so it's more visible and you can see the logic of the wiring easily. This then has a USB connection on the pump head, which is required to display, obviously, the various different things you're going to set up in L-Connect. You need to connect that up there and then run that cable through the case to the bottom and plug it into the USB port on the bottom of the motherboard. This needs to be done, otherwise the display won't work, so keep that in mind. Obviously, the AIO pump header connection means the pump's controlled by your motherboard, but if you want to control the display and the RGB lighting, you need to do it with this USB connection, so that's really important. That's connected on both ends, both the pump and the motherboard. And then we have the fan controller. So the fan controller is different to the classic Infinity one in that it has multiple connections, one for RGB and one for fan power. Usually the one that comes with the triple pack is slightly different, but this controller is able to control up to 4 different groups of fans. It does require SATA power, so you will need to connect it up to a power supply unit. I'll show you the logic for that in a minute. And what you do essentially with the basic setup is you take the fan powers that are coming out of here, connect the power to the one connector and the RGB connector to the other. You can't get this the wrong way around. The one with the clips on it is the RGB. So this is the fan power, and then there's the RGB connector that goes above that. Now, obviously, because they're daisy chainable fans, you could connect up to 3 other groups on here potentially. I'm going to show you how to do push-pull because I actually wanted to put 6 fans on this. So I'll show you that in a second. Now, included with this controller is another cable, which has a little tiny connection on the right-hand side on the bottom of the controller, and then it has different connections. One that goes to your CPU fan header on your motherboard. So that means the motherboard can have control over the CPU fans because those are the fans on the radiator, so they're the ones that are going to be cooling the liquid that goes through. And then you need 5-volt RGB header on your motherboard, but only if you want to control the RGB lighting via your motherboard software. And that's because the controller gives you the option. You can plug in USB and then control the RGB lighting via L-Connect, that's a Lian Li software, or you can use the 5-volt RGB header, which you can see here either on the top or on the bottom of this motherboard, to control the lighting and sync it with your motherboard software. Personally, I'd just stick with the USB connection. It makes life easier and you don't have to worry about loads of cables, but that USB connection will allow you to control the lighting, and you get more lighting options via L-Connect than you do anything else. The downside here is now you can see we've already got 2 USB connections here because we've got the pump head and we've got that controller, and there's only 2 connectors on the motherboard. Most modern motherboards will only have 2, sometimes only 1, very rarely 3, but we're going to quickly fill those up because, as you saw, I've also got streamers to put in here as well. So if you do have that same predicament, I have some recommendations for you because it is possible to use some other things, one of which is NZXT's USB hub. So you can see this is an additional purchase, obviously, but it allows you to connect up to 4 different USB devices into this one hub. That then has SATA power, but then also has one cable that plugs into the motherboard, so you've still got another spare port then. So that's the wiring logic for the cooler. Fairly straightforward, really easy to set up, and it's a great little thing, to be honest, especially when combined with the rest of the stuff that we're going to be putting in here, as you've seen from those initial shots, and I'll show you some more of what it looks like at the end of the video as well. Now, you don't need to do this, but I wanted to demonstrate how this case is able to handle push-pull, which I have done before, but in this time we're doing it slightly differently because we're going to put SL120 Infinity fans on the rear of the radiator as well. Again, we're using that same cable that's included with a single pack of SL120 Infinities. So you plug that into one end, connect it up as you normally would, and then it's got an RGB and fan power connector on it. Now, as standard, these cables come with a 5-volt connection, much like the one we just connected to the motherboard, but you also get extra cables included in the box with the cooler, which have an adapter that allow you to then connect it up to the controller that's included with the cooler. So you can connect up case fans to this control box, or alternatively push-pull fans as we're doing here. Obviously, connecting up these 2 uses another group on the controller, but that means you can then control everything that's on the radiator with this one controller. Now, this is the cable that's included. You'll see it has some pins in it that plug into the one that's coming out of the fans, and then the other end of it plugs into the control box. Now, for this build, I'm using this controller only to control the fans on the radiator, which means that in L-Connect, I can see one controller specifically for these, and I can manage the fan speed of the fans that are on the radiator directly. Also means with that CPU fan connection that I mentioned coming out of the controller and going into your motherboard, that the motherboard can control it if you wanted to do it that way. So 6 fans all on that rad. Now, this isn't necessary, but it is easy, especially with this logic, and it's fairly straightforward to do. And actually, the RGB is still visible through the back of the case as well, if you're wondering, although not the infinity mirrors, obviously. And make sure if you are doing this that you face the fans in the same direction. So the fans come pre-installed facing towards you, which means they're sucking air through the rad, and you want to put your fans on the other side in the same direction so they're assisting with it. Before going any further, I'd also recommend removing the protective stickers off the mirrored parts, and that's simply because they're going to be more difficult to take off when it's inside the case. But obviously take care not to scratch these mirrors when you do go about the installation. So if you are clumsier, I'll leave that decision up to you about how you put it in. Now we're going to remove the fan trays, and the fan trays come off the case in the same way for both the top and the bottom. Again, there's a couple of screws holding them in place, and then you just need to remove them. And for this, I'm using 140mm fans. So these are the 140 SL Infinity fans. Unfortunately, there's no reverse version of this at the moment. But basically, you need to make sure you're lining up that fan tray. So the way it came out of the case, you need to think about the logic of how that's going to go back in. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting it up so that the fans will be positioned in a way where we're pulling air in from the bottom of the case and also exhausting it out of the top. So my goal here is to have cool air coming in from the bottom and hot air exhausting out of the top. And then obviously we've got exhaust going through the radiator on the cooler as well. One thing to bear in mind is you'll see I'm making a mistake here if you're paying attention, in that I've got the fans a little bit too far off to the left, so I actually ended up having to adjust them because there's still a gap. So pay attention to that if you're particularly keen on getting everything right. Even now, there's still too much space on the right-hand side that I'm sure people will point out. But you can see here when we're mounting the fans on the bottom, obviously you can see the back of them. But they do fill up the bottom of the case nicely. I've shown what 120mm fans look like in here previously with reverse blade fans, and the gap's a bit large unfortunately at the bottom, so it doesn't look quite as nice. So I thought I'd try the 140mm instead just to show what that looks like, and I personally prefer it. I just hope that Lian does reverse blade 140mm Infinity fans at some point. Once that's back in place, reattach that screw to the bottom to ensure the fan tray doesn't move around. You don't want it vibrating, obviously, and having horrible sounds when you're using your build. And then repeating the process for the top tray, but obviously the fans are facing in that logic where basically going to be pulling air out of the case and exhausting out the top. You could install the fans without taking this tray out. As you can see, you've got plenty of access to it once you've taken everything else off, but it does make life easy. So they slide out. You can see there's some clips, and this is the same on both the top and bottom. You have to slide it in a certain direction in order to then maneuver it out of the case, and then you just got to remember which way around that's gone when you go and set this up. Again, I'm using 140mm fans here, and the same sort of setup logic, and wiring those in a second, and I'll show you the logic for that. But this time, because they're facing down into the case, you will be able to see the infinity mirrors, so that'll look nicer for sure. And I'm obviously skipping some of the steps for screwing this in because it's a long process. This has taken several hours to put together. So if you enjoyed this content, you find it useful, please subscribe and give me a thumbs up for all my efforts. And hopefully you've seen the wonder of what's available and what's possible here. So now we're putting that tray back in and setting it up. Again, take a note of where you've positioned the fans because you can see the gaps on either side of them. And you may want to think about that because obviously you could top mount your radiator, as I showed earlier on. It is possible to top mount a rad, and you could push pull instead. So these sort of trays account for that. And as I said, you can put 4 120mm fans on top if you prefer. Now I'm looking at the logic of where we're going to be positioning the all-in-one radiator. And obviously I wanted to demonstrate this with the standard setup initially. So just bear that in mind. Obviously the 6 fans on there. There's only 3. Now you're meant to have the tubes on the bottom of the pump head in this instance, but I just wanted to see sort of the length of the tubes. The interesting thing about this all-in-one cooler is the tubes are actually maneuverable on the radiator side, so you can see that you can actually twist them. They're designed to basically maneuver around so you can adjust the position and improve the aesthetic of your build, which ends up looking really nice, as you'll see later on. And because of the motherboard tray being customizable, you can adjust the position of it as well. A quick demo for those that want to put their tubes down. This is how that would look. Not great, I don't think. And also you need to account for the length of your GPU. Now I'm setting up and preparing the motherboard further. So we have a back plate here that's required for this cooler. Push the standoff screws for that out to the furthest corners because this is LGA 1700. So if you're following along with 13th or beyond coolers, you might need 1700 socket. That then slips into the back there. And there's no sticky tape or anything on the back of this to hold it in place. So you need to hold that there while you flip it over and then put the rest on. The next part is there are 4 rubber washers included in the box, and these need to go off over those, and these need to go over those standoffs and pushed right down tight over them, connecting it up to the motherboard, and that will then snugly hold those in place. I'd recommend tugging at the standoffs and pushing those rubber washers over the top so that they're really secure in there. It's a bit fiddly, but I found if you didn't do it hard enough, the standoff has some wobble in it where it's not properly secured. So that could then lead to it being loose, which would obviously not be ideal. And then we can secure the motherboard in place. So this is the same process I showed you earlier on with that formula motherboard. Slip it in and then use the various different standoff screws to screw it in place. There should be about 9, and you'll just screw those in quickly and carefully. And as I said, if you need to, you can always reposition the motherboard in a little while as well, as I do actually. So it's worth watching out for that, because then you can basically adjust your build depending on what you're doing. But if you think about it beforehand, you won't necessarily have that issue. So now quickly, I'm going to show you some of the connections. So this first one is USB-C, which is just below the 24-pin power supply cable. And then there's the USB-A. So this is that flat white connector that you can see here. Now this case has 4 USB-A connections on the front panel, which means you have 2 cables to plug in. Most modern motherboards don't have that, but you can buy splitter cables like this one here, which allow you to put 2 into 1. So that's what I end up doing with this build. And I am actually happy to report that it does work. So you can use something like this. It is fairly cheap, but again, this is an additional purchase. Unfortunately, Lian Li doesn't include anything like this in the box. It would be nice if they did, because that would have made life easier. But you can basically use that to then ensure that you can use all the USB-A front panel connections. And it's a bit messy, but you can fold most of that behind the case, hide the white cables away, and only have this black one on display. And I'll leave links in the description so you can see that. Then you have the data connections for your hard disk drives and SSDs. So those come from those hard disk drive cages that I showed you earlier on. And then there's a front panel connector, which is F panel, which goes in the bottom right here. And that's obviously for your power switch and other things. Check your motherboard manual to see how that lines up, which is usually on the bottom right. And you plug that in. Then we've got HD audio, which basically plugs in on the left-hand side. That's for your 3.5mm connection, so you can plug your headset into there if you want to on the front of your case where the USB connections are. Plug that in the bottom left and set that up. And then there is a 5V RGB header, and that is for the front panel RGB strip that comes on the case. Again, as before, look for the 5V RGB header on your motherboard, usually in the bottom middle-ish, sometimes on the top right. It varies from motherboard to motherboard. And then I'm plugging in that Corsair fan to a sys fan header as well. So if you're using a fan on the hard disk drive cage, don't forget that. For this build, I'm using the Corsair HX1500i power supply unit. This is a modular PSU that I've done a video on separately, but I'm going to show you the wiring logic for this and what to plug in so you can think about it beforehand. Obviously, this will vary, but mostly these ones are really easy to set up. And here's a load of cables that are included in the box, but we won't need all of them. And I'm going to be using strimmer cables, but we'll get to that in a bit. But we've got the 24-pin power supply cable, and that's always on the right-hand side. And again, I'm showing this outside the case on a different motherboard, just so you can see that. So that plugs in there, and you need to make sure that's well secured. It's split into 2 parts on the power supply end. And so push that in until it clicks into place. You'll see there's a clip on the top of it, which makes it easy to slot in, but you need to make sure that it's pushed in on both the motherboard and on the power supply so it clips in nicely. And otherwise, your motherboard might not power on, and that will be a problem. And then we have 2 CPU power connectors. These are 8-pin CPU power connectors. Not every motherboard has them. Some have 2, some have 1, some have 1 and a 4-pin. But this motherboard has 2 8-pins, so we plug in the 2 connectors. The CPU end plugs into the motherboard, so the part marked CPU plugs into the motherboard. The other end plugs into the modular power supply where it's marked CPU, and that's that set up. And this is where those would plug in the top left. Now, if you have a cable that has 1 8-pin and 1 4-pin, you can actually split these connectors so that it will still work. So it's possible to do that if you need to. The other cable we'll need is this flat SATA power connector. This is daisy chainable, but as you've seen, I've mentioned already, it's needed for the hard disk drives, for SSDs. You will also need it for the fan controllers if you're using a cooler, as I am, with the Galahad cooler, for example, and obviously for the SL120 fans as well. So it's multifunctional. You might need 2 of these depending on how many controllers you've got, but they are daisy chainable, so you can connect up multiple different things to them with ease. The power supply, when you're installing it, make sure the fan faces the back of the case because it will be pulling air in through the venting holes on the rear there. So we're just pushing that in place. There is also a little shelf inside the case which it will sit on, so it sits into there, and then you just got 4 screws that you screw into the rear and secure it to the case as well so it doesn't move around. Obviously it's quite a big power supply, as you can see. It is 1,500 watts. It's pretty massive, possibly unnecessary. I've done a video on what power supply you need for your case if you want to find out more about that, but you can see how much space there is. So then obviously once that's in, then we can plug in the cables that I showed you earlier on. I'm doing the 2 8-pin power supply cables for the CPU. And then I'm going to set up the strimmer cables, which I've done a video on separately, but these are extension cables, essentially with RGB lighting. So that plugs into the motherboard and then runs through to the back, and then the power cable for the 24-pin connector just plugs into that. And there's another cable that goes to a controller. I'll show you that in a minute. It makes the front of the case look a lot nicer, but there is a lot more cables to plug in and think about. Now I'm going to quickly secure the cooler. So work it out, making sure it looks okay. I wasn't overly happy with the tubes covering the RAM, but you can reposition the motherboard, so that is something to think about. So the tray for this pops out, and you can see that you can easily just notch it out of there and then pull it out of the back. Take care, because I did manage to bruise my thumb on this. If you've watched my videos recently and wondered why my thumb looked horrible, it's because I bruised it on that tray by accident once. It took ages for that to recover, so F in the chat for me. But then you basically put the radiator on and use the little screws to secure the radiator to this tray. This is only if you're doing a standard installation, though, obviously. You'd use that like this, but if you're going to be using push-pull, stick with me, because what you'd use is the other fans to secure it instead. But the standard setup I wanted to show, just in case you're not being crazy and aren't using 6 fans. You don't necessarily need to, as I said, but it is awesome, and it does have the space to do it. This fan tray is also flippable, so you can swap it round. You can make it face the other way. You could potentially mount the radiator on the back and hide it away, which is interesting. So there's plenty of options with it. Now we're going to install the pump head. Note that it has got pre-applied thermal paste on it, so take care not to rub that off during the installation process. This also has the Intel bracket on it already, so you don't need to worry about that. But it will work with AMD, so if you are doing an AMD build, you can use this. There's details on how to do that in the instruction manual. So now we're lining that up with the top of the CPU and those standoffs that we set down earlier on. Take care with this to gently put it in place, and then you need to use the thumb screws to secure it down. We do need to make sure that they're well secured so there's good contact. Now for this one, we're using these thumb screws here with the 4 dots on the top of them around the outside of the screw holes. I'd recommend using your hand at first to screw them in and go one corner to the other. So bottom left to top right, top left to bottom right, just to basically give even pressure across it. Now, I'd also recommend making sure that they are nice and tight though. You need to ensure that there's a good tightness here. If it's not tight enough, then your CPU may overheat. But also, just be careful not to over tighten them, because you don't want to damage the motherboard either. So it's a fine art, but the number of times I've accidentally put it on too loose and then found the CPU is running too hot. If you're worried, what I'd recommend doing is running some benchmarks after you've built your PC and see what your temps are like. And if you do find that they are a bit hot in the very high 90s, then it might be simply that it's a bit loose, and it could be something as simple as that. So if you're not using the standard radiator installation but are doing push-pull instead, then what you use is the fans that I showed earlier on, so 120mm. Make sure they're facing the same way as the ones on the front. In this case, obviously exhausting, so they're pulling air through the radiator and then pushing out the back of the case. We need some additional screws because there aren't any of these included with the cooler, but you can purchase radiator screws separately with fairly easy. Basically, long radiator screws pass through the fans, through the fan tray and into the rad, and then they hold the whole thing in place rather than the small radiator screws that we used a minute ago. So you just need to do that setup there. It is a bit more fiddly because you kind of have to hold the radiator in place while you're screwing it in. It's actually a bit beneficial the way I've done it, because you can see I've still got the small rad screws in the top here. So this is one way to do it. And then once you've secured some of the fans, because they're daisy chain, they just click into place, you can just put that final one in and then secure that down. And then you just need to think about the wiring for it again, because we need to make sure those cables are all running to the controllers. So we're now pretty far into the build. Subscribe if you haven't already. Come on, do it. You know you want to. It's free. And then you take these cables from the fans on the front, and we need to run those to the rear. And one of the interesting highlights of this, if you're not aware already with the Lian uni fans, is they have a little cap on them which allows you to adjust the cabling of them. This is really useful because what happened to me is I found that the cables for this were basically running the wrong way and it looked a bit messy, so they were going off to the right and I wanted to go to the left. What you can do is you can just pop that cap off and then adjust it. So the top cover comes off and then just can be flipped round, and then you can maneuver the cables so they face in the direction you want. This means you can neaten things up a little bit and make it tidier. Obviously I've run it through one of the rubber areas. You could even potentially run it at the bottom of the fan to make it even neater. And there's plenty of space to make things look really tidy in this case as well, and to tuck cables away, which is beneficial. Now, just as a reminder, we need to use the controller for the AIO for these fans and the ones on the rear. And as I said, you could use a single controller for all the fans I've got set up in this if you wanted to. So this controller has a double-sided sticker which you can put on there and then you can find somewhere in the case to stick it onto. It's a good idea to do this, but also to plan it out before you do it, because I made a mistake of thinking that the bottom would be a good spot for this. I was thinking that was near where the cables were coming from, the bottom of the rad on both the front and the back, and that the USB connection would run to the motherboard really easily here and the SATA connection. But the one thing I forgot was the CPU fan power connector. So just think about where you're going to plug in all the different things. So obviously the RGB connectors and fan power connectors from both sets of fans plug in. Now I chose group 1 and 2 for this. The reason for that is that you can then make a mental note of that, and then when you're in the L-Connect software, you can look at those groups and you can adjust the fan speed specifically for those 6 fans on the radiator in L-Connect to account for your CPU temperatures, whether that's creating a custom curve or using a standard one and just flicking the speed around on the fly. If you're adding in other groups of system fans and connect them to the same controller, that means you can separate the logic out a bit more. Then this control box obviously needs SATA power, don't forget that, because that's important, otherwise the fans will not turn on, and the USB connection so you can control it via L-Connect. As a reminder, you'll also need that CPU fan connector and the RGB connector if you want to control the RGB from your motherboard software. But that's where I then realized that obviously I was going to have a problem because this is too low at the bottom of the case and I can't reach the cable for the CPU fan connector, so I ended up moving it to the top. Now, not a major issue because the stick was still there, but obviously you don't want to keep removing and re-sticking a sticker like that because it might end up losing its stick. And that's one thing to think about. I also have to put 2 more controllers in here yet. I need the Strimmer controller and another SL120 Infinity controller, simply because I wanted to separate out the system fan cables. Now you don't need to do that, but I wanted to have 2 different controllers, one for the CPU cooler and one for the system fans. Just for the simplicity of it. And you'll also notice that I do add in a rear 120mm fan as well. So the AIO pump connection, don't forget, this one is on the bottom left of the CPU here, or alternatively it's on the top right. You need to run somewhere for that cable. It was a bit long, so it was a bit fiddly, and I ended up running it to the back of the case and then through and round and down, so it was a bit neater, and tried to tuck some of it away. It is unfortunately a bit messy there, but that's just the design of this motherboard. Then the tubes weren't in the right position for me. They're blocking the RAM a little bit. I thought maybe if I raised the motherboard up, put it into the higher position, that would then reduce that. But also I wanted to do this because I'm using the Strimmer power cable, so the RGB extension cable for the graphics card. I figured that if I had more space at the bottom to run that cable, it would put less pressure on the GPU cable, but also show off more of that RGB lighting. It also means there's a big gap between the fans and the graphics card. Something to consider. Obviously, you could also do vertical mounting in this case as an alternative, and upright GPU mounting as I showed as well. You can then reposition the tubes on the radiator as well and neaten things up, and it also comes with some Velcro ties so you can tie those tubes together and make it look a little neater. It is nice to be able to adjust this and customize the position of it depending on your aesthetic, and it's designed to do that as well, so you don't need to panic. Don't forget though, we need to make sure we connect up that USB connection, otherwise you won't be able to control the display via L-Connect. You may need a firmware update as well, and those things can be done via L-Connect too. So get L-Connect downloaded as soon as you've set your system up. Don't panic as well if your fans don't spin up immediately, because sometimes they'll set to 0 RPM on the first boot if they're brand new, so that's worth watching out for. But you should find if you've connected everything up that they do spin up and do light up as well. So I run that USB cable through to the back, then around the back and down and into the bottom of the motherboard. As I said, I had to use a USB hub for this though, because with multiple different things requiring USB, you do need those extra connections. So with the strimmer cable, don't forget to plug in the 24-pin power cable from that into the extension cable. And then that cable with the RGB lighting on it also has a little connector which needs to go to the strimmer's own controller. So the strimmer, both the 24-pin and the PCIe one that goes to your graphics card, require powering and control via a separate controller, which is different from the all-in-one cooler controller and the Infinity controller, and so more USB and more SATA power and other connections are required. But this is the cable that plugs into that. I've done a video separately on the 24-pin and the other PCIe connections with the strimmers. If you want to see that wiring guide and just tips on that, I'll link to those in the description. And this is fairly straightforward, but you can see it is completely different to the other controllers, so you can't use it sadly with the fans. And it does mean that you need to think about the space in your case if you're going to be doing it. But that's a good thing about this EVO XL is it's pretty massive. So there is plenty of space in there for this. And then now we've got a load of USB connections, so that's something to keep in mind. And also don't forget we need SATA power for all of these things, which is why I said earlier on you might need more than one SATA cable, because if you're putting in hard disk drives, SSDs, and multiple controllers like this, chances are you'll need more power for all of these different things. Bit of a fiddle and loads of extra cables, but luckily because of the positioning of the GPU, it should be fairly easy to install an extra SATA cable if you need it into the power supply unit. Obviously that comes with your PSU, so being modular, it's fairly easy to install when you need to. So for sorting out the USB problem with this build, I actually end up using Corsair's USB hub. So I mentioned NZXT earlier. Lian also does one, so there are various different options, but like the NZXT one, this is a 4-port USB hub. It's also magnetic, so it will stick to the case, so rather than needing stickers, so that's beneficial. But I'm plugging in the multiple different controllers into it and then using that to then control them via one USB connection. It requires SATA power, so that needs to be connected to the PSU and obviously to your motherboard, but then that means that you are freeing up the other ports. So I have one port dedicated to the all-in-one pump, and then the other one is dedicated to all these other controllers. So lots of controllers to deal with, lots of cables to deal with, make sure they're all connected up. And obviously you can see my cable mess here. It is a mess, and I'm aware of that. So just feel free to criticize if you want to. And then we're plugging in the graphics card. So this is my 4090, and you'll get an idea of the size and what I was talking about earlier with the support bracket for it. And don't forget that obviously notching it back in on the rear and then putting those standoffs down on that flap to hold it in place, and that'll secure it nicely. And then we have the 600 watt strimmer cable, so this plugs in. You've got to be careful not to put tension on it, but the good news is I've found that it doesn't really have an issue because of the size of the case. It's not pressing up against the cable with the glass, and because of where I've got the motherboard position, you can see plenty of the cable, and you can make it look pretty neat and get maximum RGB lighting going on there as well. So I'm actually really pleased with how this has come out at the end. It looks really nice as my main build, and I'm really happy with the overall design of it. It is a little bit fiddly though, and again, there's another cable that needs to be plugged into this, and obviously you need that special cable from your PSU to connect up to the other end of that PCIe cable to, and then you need to make sure it's connected up to the controller, and then that's all powered. Again, I've done separate videos on those trimmers if you're a bit confused or if you want to know more about them and how to set them up. But they are pretty nifty. They just work as extension leads, so it's basically neatening things up and allowing you to sync the RGB across the case even more. So if you're really into RGB, that's the way to go, but you can see it does complicate things a bit. And then I've got the other Lian Li Infinity controller there, which I'm using for the system case fans. So the ones that I installed on the bottom of the case and the top of the case, and that single one at the rear, that's not necessary. But I thought it was worth showing the logic of how I've done it. You could just use the all-in-one cooler controller instead and still connect up most of those fans, with the exception of the rear one. And then once that's done, even if you do have a cable shame, I'm happy to report that you can close the SSD tray on that. The magnets just pop in there and it's held in place, and then you can put the door on. And obviously we've got that venting at the rear for the hard disk drive fan and for the power supply unit, and so it should have good cooling, and it does shut nicely. And then this is the final result. And one of many different styles of build that you can do in this case, which, as I said, I have demonstrated now. If you want to see a video in depth on all the different things that you can do with it, all the different formats, if you want encouragement for maybe considering something else, or maybe you want to do upright GPU mounting, for example, then check out the links in the description. But as a standard build, I think it looks absolutely stunning. This has been the Provoked Prawn. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, subscribe and check out the links in the description to find out more. Thanks very much for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.